Solid book.
For joining us today. I'm Kim Donovan, the director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative within the Geoeconomic Center. My team at the Atlantic Council focuses on the levers of economic power that governments use to advance foreign policy and national security objectives. We also analyze the evasion tactics, illicit finance, and money laundering techniques adversarial actors use to get around these sanctions, export controls, and other economic measures. This is why I am thrilled for our discussion today with Eddie Fishman about his new book, Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Following our conversation, some of the main characters in the book will join us on stage to share their firsthand experience wielding the tools of economic statecraft and warfare to tackle national security challenges related to Iran, Russia, and China. To get started, I would like to introduce Eddie Fishman, author of Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Eddie has served as the Department of State's policy planning staff, advising Secretary of State John Kerry on Europe, Eurasia, and economic sanctions. Prior to this role, he was lead for Russia and Europe in the Office of Economic Sanctions Policy and Implementation, where he played a key role in negotiating sanctions in response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine in 2014, and worked on Iran sanctions during nuclear talks. He's currently a senior research scholar at Columbia University and a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council with our Eurasia Center. So Eddie, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations on your book.
Kim, thank you. And thank you all for being here. Before Kim gets started, I just want to say, I left government in 2017, and I think the first thing I did the next day was to become a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council. So this has been a second home for me for a long time, and I'm so excited for the conversation today.
Thank you. And I just have to give you massive kudos. I mean, Chokepoints is a fantastic book. It is really well-researched and thoroughly examines how sanctions policy has been used within the United States to advance our different foreign policy challenges. So, just to kind of set the scene, I was wondering if you could discuss for us what inspired you to write this book and publish now?
Sure, yeah. So it really goes back to my own experience working on these issues in the 2010s, because this was my formative experience really working on the Iran sanctions that led to the JPOA, the interim nuclear deal in 2013, and then working on the Russia sanctions after the annexation of Crimea. And something I noticed, and particularly after I moved over to the policy planning staff working for Secretary Kerry, was that when folks would go to the Situation Room to discuss issues like the crisis in Ukraine or Iran's nuclear program, whenever the topic of sanctions came up, or really any economic topic, most of the room would just go quiet. And I think that's because in Washington, economics, and in particular tools of economic statecraft, feel arcane. They can feel confusing. And even people who've spent their careers working on national security and foreign policy sometimes just don't really understand these tools. And it was a really significant difference, I noticed, Kim, for instance, when we were talking about, for instance, whether or not we should arm the Ukrainians in 2014, where everyone had an opinion. Even if we were from the State Department or the CIA or the NSC, it didn't matter. It wasn't just the Pentagon dominating that conversation. And at the same time, over this period, tools of economic statecraft really started reshaping the international order, right? I mean, completely undoing the whole notion of globalization that we built in the 1990s, that all economic relationships were win-win. And so after I left government, I really believed that we had to elevate our national discourse on things like sanctions and export controls and tariffs for us to have intelligent policies. And so the first thing I did really was to start writing about these topics, but really to start teaching. And so I've been teaching at Columbia University for the last several years a class on economic statecraft. And it was actually, you asked why now? It was actually when I was teaching in February and March of 2022, when Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we saw some unprecedented economic measures, like the freezing of Russia's central bank reserves, where I started getting notes from students from all over Columbia being like, "Can I sit in on your class?" And I keep it a pretty tight ship. I like running a seminar, so I oftentimes would be like, "No, I'll meet with you outside of class." But my students were like, "We really need this needs to touch a broader audience." And so it was really then in 2022 that I decided really to take what I had been teaching my students and turn it into a book that I could share with everyone.
That's fantastic, and we very much appreciate you being able to do that. And then, so I know some of us that are in our audience maybe haven't gotten a chance to read your book yet. So I was wondering if you could just kind of walk us through the book a little bit, because one of the things that I found really interesting in how you organized it was that you've focused specifically on different national security challenges. So looking at Iran, Russia, and China. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk us through your reasoning behind that framework.
Yeah. So look, this is my first book, and so other people may have dealt with this challenge. I think one of the hardest things to do as an author, especially if you're writing contemporary history or history of any sort, is selection, right? What do you include? What do you not include? And my book really starts from the premise that we are living in an age of economic warfare. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, they've become the primary way that great powers compete with one another. There are a number of reasons for that. One is, we still do have nuclear weapons, and so we really don't want to fight China or Russia if we can avoid it. But another factor is that really in the wake of the 1990s, with hyperglobalization, our economies became deeply integrated with our adversaries like Russia and China. And at the time, we didn't view them as our adversaries. And so what this has enabled really is it has enabled great power competition to play out in this domain of economic warfare. And so what I really wanted to do, and the reason I decided to sort of select Iran, Russia, and China as the focuses of the book, is those are really the cases, in my view, where we have started seeing economic warfare reshape the global economy, right? Because even you go back to the 90s, sanctions on narco traffickers, or even some of the sanctions on terrorist groups that occurred right after 9/11, I think you could have done that to your heart's content without undoing globalization, really. It's not until you start doing things like imposing sanctions on Russian banks and energy companies, or cutting China off from the most advanced technologies from Silicon Valley, that you start having these effects that go well beyond sort of just the target themselves.
That's a really good point. That helps me understand it too, because my background, I've covered counterterrorism and I've seen where sanctions can be really effective. But then here at the Atlantic Council, when we've been looking at how we've used sanctions to advance our objectives related to Russia, we're seeing where there's kind of this bifurcation happen within the financial system. So Eddie, one of the things I really appreciate about your book is that not only did you walk us through the history of how sanctions and these policy decisions were made, but you highlighted the people that were behind a lot of these different actions and these very difficult strategies and policy decisions. And we have the pleasure of having several of these folks here today. So at this point, I did want to welcome our panelists and experts up to the stage to join us for the second portion of the conversation. So as everyone gets settled, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Daniel Freed, who is a Weiser Distinguished Fellow. He's a Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he's previously served as a U.S. Ambassador to Poland. He is a veteran U.S. diplomat who served in the State Department's first ever Coordinator for Sanctions Policy from 2013 to 2017. And notably, he led diplomacy with Europe to impose joint U.S. and EU sanctions on Russia after its 2014 annexation of Crimea. To my right, Stuart Levy, who is Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer of Oracle Corporation, where he leads the company's global legal and compliance functions. Formerly, he served as the U.S. Treasury Department's first Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence under both President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama, developing a new strategy to isolate Iran from the international financial system. And Adam Zubin, who is a professor of practice at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He previously served as director of the Treasury Department's OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, from 2006 to 2015, and later as acting undersecretary for terrorism and financial intelligence. And he has been considered one of the key architects of U.S. sanctions against Iran in the years leading up to the 2015 nuclear deal. And Nazak Nikatar is chair of the National Security for Wiley Rein, LLC. Formerly, she served as the Department of Commerce's Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration, as well as acting Undersecretary for Industry and Security at the Bureau of Industry. of the U.S. Department of Commerce. In these roles, Nazak was the agency's primary liaison with U.S. industry and trade associations, and she played a pivotal role in overseeing export controls which were levied against China during the first Trump administration. So thank you all for taking the time to meet with us today. We're really excited to have this conversation with everyone. So Eddie, turning back to Chokepoints, to your book, for those of us who don't know, could you explain what exactly do you consider a choke point and why is that significant?
I'm glad you asked this because one other question that I think is related to that is what makes sanctions today new, right? Because obviously we have sanctions going back all the way to ancient Greece, right? And Napoleon has an embargo on Britain in the early 19th century. And of course, you have embargoes in World War II all the way up to the present day. And I think choke points is really what, in my view, distinguishes what we've seen in this age of economic warfare, which I really date to the mid-aughts to the present. Going back to the 90s when we imposed a UN-backed embargo on Iraq that really aimed to stop Iraq from selling its oil on global markets, in order to do that, the UN actually authorized a multinational naval force to deploy in the Persian Gulf, monitor ships going in and out of Iraqi ports 24/7 for 13 years. So that is what economic warfare used to look like, even as recently as the 1990s. What some of these folks on the stage pioneered, in my view, was a new form of economic warfare, which leverages these choke points, which are areas of the global economy in which one state has a dominant position and there are very few, if any, alternatives. And these choke points really only form after the 90s, once you start bringing in China and Russia into the global economy. Because before that, we really didn't have any economic interdependence. You asked what are the key choke points. I'm sure Stuart and others will expand on this. The number one and most important is the dollar and the US dollar-based financial system. Really, it is impossible or very, very difficult to do business as a multinational enterprise without access to the dollar and the US-based financial system. In recent years, we've also discovered other choke points that the US can leverage, such as parts of the semiconductor supply chain and energy supply chains. But one final point I want to say about choke points before I turn it back over to you, Kim, is that these choke points are not immutable, right? They change over time. Typically, they're actually formed by the private sector. The government can help, in terms of encouraging dominance in certain sectors. But it's not like the U.S. government says we're going to have a choke point here and it happens, right? Oftentimes they kind of just happen, and increasingly there are many choke points that are not under U.S. control. And a key one really is the clean energy supply chain, where you see everything from the critical minerals to the batteries, and now even the finished electric vehicles, which China dominates, not the United States. Yeah. And so I think it's imperative for us to understand this concept, not just as a means of American economic warfare, but also something we may need to defend against when China wages economic warfare against us.
That's a really good point, especially in the environment we're in today. I mean, all of our panelists here, you're all very important characters in this book and in shaping U.S. economic, foreign policy and how we've used economic tools, as Eddie has noted. I mean, would you agree with Eddie's description of choke points? And was this concept something that you had in mind as you were thinking through and developing different strategies that we could deploy sanctions with? And I open that to anyone who would like to jump in first.
I approached the issue of sanctions somewhat differently when it came to Russia. The problem, as it seemed to me at the time, was that the model we were drawing from was the Iran sanctions model, in which basically the US made unilateral decisions and then beat up the Europeans to follow them. And the Europeans did so reluctantly. We usually got our way. The sanctions turned out to be reasonably effective. But this was not going to work with respect to Russia. And in addition to thinking about it strategically, I had a bureaucratic problem, which is that the NSC under Obama was divided about how strong to respond to the Russian initial invasion against Ukraine. And they decided wrongly not to send weapons to Ukraine. I mean, bad call. Tory Nuland fought against it, state fought against it, but it didn't matter. We lost that battle. On sanctions, the NSC was divided. And the compromise they came up with is, well, we'll let State Department talk about sanctions, but we'll only go as far as the EU is willing to go, thinking that that would be very small sanctions. So my negotiating mandate, instead of being detailed, was very simple. You can go as far as the Europeans can go and no farther, thinking that would be a bureaucratic choke point on our own policy. But as it turns out, looked at that. No, it wasn't that I was persuasive, it became a license. If we can go no farther than the Europeans, well, that means whatever we agree to with the Europeans becomes the policy because Washington can't make it weaker. So that meant that instead of going out there and beating up the Europeans with a preset plan, I got to sit down and say, well, what are we going to do? And then close a deal. Do a handshake deal and inform Washington. And I never did a single thing without Treasury, Commerce, and often NSC. Now, I learned that trust Adam Zubin, trust the OFAC people. I don't know. I wasn't supposed to trust you. State wanted me to combat you, and I thought, this is stupid. If I do that, I'm going to lose.
Such a Washington conversation.
Yeah, right? I'm going to lose. So we could make handshake deals with the Europeans at the table in Europe and then report them to Washington. And you had your interagency process being worked out overseas by the negotiating delegation. Now that's a really Washington wonky thing, but it meant that we were controlling it. And the NSC, the people who didn't want sanctions were furious because they didn't think the Europeans would go as far as they did. But one of the reasons the Europeans did go so far is because the Russians, the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner really pissed off the Europeans. And they started to realize that this was serious business. And secondly, they realized they could do a deal with us in the field and help shape US policy. And that was empowering for everybody except the NSC people who wanted to choke us. Now, Tony Blinken was Deputy National Security Advisor at the time, and he was the one who gave me the political cover. He crafted this, which appeared, this general negotiating instruction, which appeared to the skeptics and the ones who wanted a weak policy to be a choke, and he knew it would be a license. And he gave me the backing I need, just so we're clear as to who was who. So that's the way I was thinking about it. And I was also conscious that I was working with the sanctions. We're speaking out of order because I was acutely aware that my ability to come up with sanctions was a product of what Stuart Levy had done and Adam Zubin had done. So I was able just to take advantage of the institutional capacity of those, very clever and aggressive people at OFAC and put it to good use. Anyway, long way of telling a story, sort of it's implied in the Eddie Fishman in the book, but I really wanted to foot stomp that.
Kimberly, I want to add to that, and this is just something from recent example. I mean, we, with the Russian sanctions, we knew what the choke points are, right? We know that the choke points are just all the financial transactions in Russia, yet we didn't go that route, the US government. I analogize sanctions to, in a way, like to antibiotics, right? Like you need a shock treatment at once, but if you dribble it in over time, right, countries are going to figure out paths to get around them. And we didn't go comprehensive at once, which is why this war has gone on. And I'll give you one example just to show how leaving elements of this choke point out mean that you're not really going after the choke point. Rusal wasn't sanctioned for a while, right? Post Russia's most recent invasion of Ukraine. And Rusal was building weapons for Russia, building mines, et cetera, for Russia's war on Ukraine. And even though the global aluminum market had gone away from purchasing from Rusal, the London Metal Exchange was taking all of Rusal's unsold aluminum, and through the London Metal Exchange building up the aluminum, the world prices were crashing, right? And so, and Russia is no worse off. So, and finally, the government sanctioned Rusal. So the key point of this is, even when we identify choke points, we're too afraid in the US government to go comprehensively because of whatever the actions are. And at the end of the day, our actions end up being weak and not really targeting a choke point in the way that we mentally envisioned it.
I think that's really fair, because even just leading up to what, with the 2022 invasion and our focus on oligarchs in the first instance, and then we went after the military-industrial complex further on, it's been an interesting kind of, when we take a step back, of like, how much do we really know what, like really know what the choke points were? And I know we can get to it in the conversation, but just being able to truly identify and have the economic analysis so that we're effectively targeting the investor.
I think your general critique is fair, but I want to break it down a little bit more. I think the initial round of sanctions in 2014 was tough enough that it surprised Putin, and he temporarily backed off. He dropped his claims to so-called Novorossiya, which was his big claim against, huge part of Ukraine. He dropped it. And he agreed to the Minsk Accords, which, for all their faults, actually could have provided the framework for a settlement if Putin had wanted it. I think where you're right is that when it became clear that Putin had no intention of ever respecting the Minsk Accords, we didn't double down. And Eddie gets into it in the book. I think at that point, we let the sanctions level off. And I think in retrospect, that was a mistake. And then we really let it level off in 2016. So and I think the other point you could make, if I jump ahead to the section on the Biden administration, you notice that they waited to drop the hammer on Russian oil revenue until after our elections. Okay, so that is not a disagreement, that's sort of a corrective.
Yeah. And my key point was about the sanctions that were imposed from 2022 onwards.
Yeah.
Because I think we just showed a little bit too much hesitation and gave Russian enterprises ample room to work with China, et cetera, to get around the sanctions, but not 2014, because I think those were fine.
Well, actually, I want to bring Iran kind of into the conversation a little bit through you, Stuart, and Adam. I mean, when you were kind of working through the thought process on how we could get Iran to the negotiating table, how sanctions are being used, I mean, were choke points kind of the principle of that, or was it more of this bureaucratic choke point situation that Ambassador Fried discussed? Well,
maybe I'll start, and Adam can continue. Certainly the bureaucratic piece was part of it, and Eddie tells the story about how once we had a set of ideas, the first step was to see if we can get the State Department on our side instead of to oppose us. And
the internal dynamics is
he tells the story of how once we had our ideas, I took it to Secretary Rice, and she said, "That sounds like a great idea. What do you need me to do?" I was like, "Just tell your people that you're in favor, and that'll help, because otherwise it'll be very difficult." But I actually liked Eddie's description at the beginning of identifying a choke point, and for Iran, the obvious choke point that was the financial system. And he tells the story of how we came to the idea first. And I say we, I'm referring to Adam, who was a critical part of it. We did hear President Bush say, "We're all sanctioned out on Iran." He said, he was confronted in the debate, and he said, "Why don't you put sanctions on Iran?" I said, we're sanctioned out. We're out of sanctions. And I did take that as like, well, how can that be? Here that's supposed to be my job. I'm supposed to be able to come up with that kind of stuff. And it's really obvious now that we weren't sanctioned out on Iran. But it's not that, the people who were in the government for the 20 years before that were just as smart as we are. Why did everyone think we were sanctioned out? And I remember asking, the team, well, what are our options to increase sanctions? And I, got back a list. Well, we have economic sanctions. They're comprehensive on Iran. There's some exceptions, like there's pistachios. And I thought, that is not going to stop their nuclear program, right? But that was the first reaction was, the pistachios and rugs, carpets, whatever. Like, no, we got to do better. And we started thinking, and it did finally come to us, like, we were thinking about sanctions as things that the government could do, and then try to get other governments to do it with us. And if you're going to do it that way, you might need a naval force to do it, and you're going to be limited. You're not going to have Dan's dynamic, because the odds are the other governments are not going to do anything. Particularly on Iran, where they were more, because we had already sanctioned ourselves, the other governments had more of an economic interest in doing business with Iran than we did. So how are we going to do that? And we decided the small insight was, let's just blow off the governments and go straight to the private sector and get them to do it. And we could do that because we controlled the financial system. And that all seems so obvious to us now because we've spent 20 years doing it, but it apparently wasn't obvious because we hadn't started doing it before. And that was the small insight that then led to like lots of other pieces that came after.
Did you want to add to that? Or?
I agree with everything that Mr. was saying, aside from that I was an all-key player here. I feel like, first of all, the term architect, I feel like I was sitting in the architect's office at the time these sanctions were developed, and I was very good about getting coffee when the architect needed it. And there's an importance to that. I'm not going to underplay it, because the architect gets cranky. I want to sort of embrace the opening question that you were framing around choke points, because to me that is exactly the right way to think about these tools, the weaponization of choke points. But a lot of our discussion today has been about the need for and the advantages of that. And I think we also should be talking about the double-edged sword, the perils and the risks of that. And I'll just give two examples of things we haven't weaponized that we could have. So ICANN, which is the institution that provides internet domain addresses to the World Wide Web, was a US company. I mean, the internet was created by the Defense Department, and it was set up in the United States. We had geographic jurisdiction over it. And for a while, it was US government controlled. We could have said, X adversary, you don't get any domains, right? Russia, you can't be on the World Wide Web. China, you can't be on the World Wide Web. And I think everyone in the audience will have different views about the coherence, the logic, the advantages, the disadvantages of that. But what we today know as the World Wide Web wouldn't be that. It would be a Western web, and we'd have perhaps a decoupling or a fragmented internet. We have a choke point in the United Nations. The United Nations is sitting on US soil. For a diplomat to get here, they have to land at Kennedy Airport. And we control the visas to that. And at times, the US has said no to a diplomat, you can't come in. We haven't really weaponized that. We haven't said to all of our adversaries, you can no longer come to the UN. And I think it's pretty quick, you'd find pretty quickly that the UN headquarters wouldn't be here anymore. Because we can't have United Nations where countries are saying to other countries who can and can't come. And imagine how we would feel if Switzerland, which is another headquarters site for the UN, said to US diplomats, you can no longer show up. So these are all choke points of different types, and the question of do you weaponize or do you not is one that I think warrants a lot of attention, because Eddie talked about how choke points can change, and Stuart mentioned this too over time. That's not purely out of our control. We can accelerate a move away from a US-based, a US-centered system if we're too quick and too aggressive to weaponize.
That's a great point, and it actually leads me to a question I've been kind of dying to ask all of you too, is because we have seen over the past 20 years where there's just been this massive increase in the use of these tools. And sometimes they're working, sometimes they're not. I think we're still trying to figure out how we can truly measure the effectiveness of them. But why are we using these tools at such a pace, as opposed to other, whether it's military intervention, diplomatic, different things in cyberspace? Just if any of you have thoughts, I feel like you all are kind of the architects of the current system.
I mean, some of it is obvious, right? I mean, these are very low cost, very low cost. Think about, we can impose some of these financial measures with just like, a memo or less, and some of the other tools of coercion are extraordinarily expensive, not just in money, but in lives. And that's always been the appeal. So it's easy to turn to them. It's very hard to turn to the Pentagon and ask them for a solution or order a solution. And that's the obvious reason. And that's what leads to this whole tension about needing to really curate the use of your tools so that you want your leverage, but if you overuse it, you'll diminish it, and so you have to figure out when are you going to spend your leverage. And I think Eddie has a lot of good discussion of that in the book about how you want to, use it, but use it wisely.
So here's a story that I thought of when I read the portion in Eddie's book where he talks about the need for economic sanctions as an alternative to military action. So 2001, before 9/11, George W. Bush and Tony Blair are having their first meeting. It's up at Camp David, and they're reviewing the world. And I'm in the NSC, so I'm busy. I'm taking the notes. And they get to Iraq, and they agree that the sanctions have failed. That's not working. And we have to, if we ever have to deal with Saddam Hussein, sanctions are not the way. Well, we know what we eventually did. If I could go back in a time machine, to any point of the Bush administration, it might be that, where I would drop in and write a note to myself, wait, there's this guy, Stuart Levy and Adam Zubin, you give them jobs, they can make a sanctions regime that will work. So you will have a viable alternative if you want to hit Saddam Hussein hard. I've thought about that for many years. That's why you need sanctions. And that's why policymakers look at them. It's not that they're sanctions happy, it's that they're looking for that mid-ground between the diplomatic note of the firm protest and war. And we used to do covert action. That's what we did in that space. And there is still a place for that kind of stuff, but sanctions, that scratches the itch. And that's why what these guys created is a useful tool. And
Adam and I are responsible for the Iraq War now.
No, you are no, had you, the absence, had you been earlier, that would have, had the president understood that the sanctions tool was as powerful as it later became, is the real answer.
Well, I'm joking, obviously, but for the record, I was not there. I did not take my job until 2004, the Iraq War. Well, but you're right about like we came to understand that the particular choke point of the financial system was more powerful than people had imagined.
Exactly.
And the best example was with North Korea, which was even before Iran, is when sort of when I first started at Treasury, and so we took action against this very small bank in Macau, and we only froze like $20 million, and it kind of completely shocked everybody. It completely shocked the Chinese in particular, and it imposed an enormous amount of pressure because everyone wanted to avoid that fate. People realized, like, whoa, this is incredibly powerful. I think back as we were preparing to do that, I remember some, typical Washington thing, the NSC meetings, and I came forward and with Danny Glazer and Juan Zarate, who had really been pushing this North Korea stuff. And they said, okay, we want to take this action, this regulatory action against this little bank in Macau. And we explained it. And I literally got people saying, well, why didn't you do the Bank of China instead of this little bank in Macau? Like, how about the Bank of China? And boy, if we had done that, I don't know what would have happened. But anyway, it did surprise people how powerful. And I think we came to learn the power of these things by doing. And we also had the element of surprise when we were doing it, because no one had done it before. Now I think that's faded a little bit, and I still think it's a very powerful choke point. But we no longer have the element of surprise to it. And so you have the Chinese or the Russians, looking for alternative mechanisms to sort of avoid this power.
I want to add additional 3 points. I think one of the key aspects of Eddie's work, Eddie's book, is this notion of choke points means scoping, right? Throughout the book, it's just this notion of how are you scoping it? Are you scoping it wide? Are you scoping it narrow? And part of the question is, what's left outside the choke points? And what are we going to do about those? And how are our targets of our sanctions going to capitalize on what's been left out to grow, et cetera? The question, Kimberly, about the 20-year period is so critical, because it is within that 20-year, really speaking about Russia and China now, that since the early 2000s to now is when they started accumulating greater ambitions, technology, et cetera. And so our use has been, of these tools has been commensurate with not only the rise of China predominantly and also Russia in this space, but then their aggressiveness to use their growing power to do things. The final point I wanted to make is that even though we're talking about the sanctions, we also have to keep in mind that there will be soon, around the corner, this breakthrough in adoption of digital currencies. And what does that mean in our ability to maintain sanctions, our power over sanctions and our power over the US dollar and global banks? And do we need to capitalize on our ability to use sanctions now before potentially that ability disappears?
Or can we impose rules on digital currencies that preserve the use of sanctions, which is something which I think is definitely worth thinking about, and I would strongly encourage people to do. If I can, this is something that Adam and I spent a lot of time on, but I feel pretty strongly about this. The reason sanctions work well right now is that the intermediaries are the real enforcers. And big financial institutions are very careful. They make sure they scrutinize transactions. They may miss some, but they scrutinize them. They're worried about OFAC, and it takes a lot of work. A big financial institution like Citi or something like that probably has 1,000 people working on this. Okay, the whole point of digital currencies or crypto is it eliminates those intermediaries. That's the underlying premise of them. And if you don't take account of that and figure out how you're going to deal with it, you will lose the ability of having those intermediaries, which are important to sort of enforce sanctions. So the U.S. still has the power, I think, to come up with rules that could be imposed in this area that the world would respect. But if we miss that opportunity, we will lose this, I think, very important national security tool. So, I would frankly encourage the new administration to think hard about, ways in which they can preserve that and take this risk seriously.
I do want to come back to this cryptocurrency and alternative payments discussion, but I thought I'd love to talk about some of the specific examples in the book just on what we did with Iran, Russia, China, because you all have such incredibly unique stories from your experience doing this. And my question for you, Stuart, it kind of gets to your point on the intermediaries and the financial connectivity. And you touched on this earlier, but I thought one of the key challenges in applying economic pressure on Iran was that the U.S. didn't have the ability to cut off its oil exports. And the U.S. itself didn't buy Iranian oil, but there was no chance that Washington could really persuade other countries to end their own purchases. And as Eddie recalls in his book, shortly after President Bush's reelection, and as you pointed out, he lamented that the U.S. had sanctioned ourselves out of influence with Iran. He also notes that he describes a moment when you were flipping through a newspaper over breakfast in Bahrain and had an epiphany on how to prove the president wrong. And I was wondering, could you walk us through?
Yeah, I don't know that I was put it quite that I was trying to prove him wrong, but I wanted to help him. So, the point was that we did start approaching the banks, and we started. In order to get to oil revenues, you need to get these countries on board with you. And the theory was, if you got their financial sectors to pull back from doing business with Iran, it would be easier to get the governments as well. And we sort of went over the heads of the government straight to the financial institutions, and there are lots of good, you all got to read it, good stories about how, the things that we did to persuade the banks of the risks, and my persuading then Secretary Paulson that it was important to go out and talk to the banks. We weren't going to sanction all the banks, we were going to persuade them. Anyway, even that, the government's resented. And I recall, I'll tell one story, because stories are more fun than anything else. I remember going to France very early on in this, and I was going to meet with the banks and make my presentation about the risks of doing business with Iran, and I did that. And then I went to see the French finance ministry, and my counterpart was really lit into me and said, "What are you doing? You're going to meet with my banks, and I regulate these banks. What are you telling them about the risks for?" And Dan will love this, because I remember sitting there thinking, "Oh man, the State Department's going to love this. I've caused some huge diplomatic problem. They're just waiting for the Treasury Department to screw it up." I remember calling the secretary, Secretary Paulson, after that meeting, and saying, what had happened. And I thought, I'm sorry, I think I may have. And he's like, "What are they talking about? Their banks? I mean, these banks can't survive without America." And that was sort of the whole underlying premise of this, that they listened to us, and that was true everywhere in the world.
That's really interesting, because I think that type of financial diplomacy really became the way, TFI in particular, kind of leaned forward on a lot of these issues. Looking back, is there anything you would have done differently, or?
I think we learned by doing, and so we made mistakes, I'm sure. I probably would have, would have handled that meeting differently, or there were some things I would have done differently. But I think when I look back on it, my one big regret is that how little I knew when I started, and not just because we hadn't done it before, but because I knew nothing about finance. And I think that's one of the things that would have benefited me and anyone in that role, is to have a more complete knowledge of how the financial system worked. And I didn't. I subsequently went and worked at a bank, but I didn't have that experience before this job. And then he tells the story of one of the characters in the book, Dalip Singh, who I don't even particularly know well, but he has deep knowledge, and you can see how valuable it is to craft these things. And maybe I would have been able to do a better job if I had had that knowledge when I started.
That's it. Even when I started at Treasury, I didn't fully realize how much money makes the world go around, and the connection of the financial system makes it go around. Adam, I wanted to turn to you, because you worked closely with Stuart on these issues when you were OFAC director, and then as acting undersecretary of TFI. However, not long after Stuart left TFI, Congress then began pressuring the Obama administration to sanction Iran's central bank. And to cut its oil sales off completely. So Eddie describes in the book how this congressional pressure, maybe as frustrating as it was, ultimately forced Treasury to develop innovative strategies, leading to a two-thirds reduction in Iran's oil sales and the freezing of $100 billion in restricted bank accounts. Can you talk about this dynamic with Congress and the strategies that it led to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated equilibrium. When Washington is working well, it's a complicated equilibrium with power sharing and balance between the legislative and the executive branches. And we thought we were, the hawks in the room, and often we were when it came to Iran sanctions, if you're talking about the interagency discussion. But there were folks on the Hill who wanted to be far more hawkish. And as you said, and as Eddie tells the story in his book, who wanted to freeze all the assets of the central bank of Iran and require all other countries to stop importing Iran's oil, period, to go cold turkey overnight. central banks are seen in the world of finance ministries in much the way that embassies are seen in the world of diplomacy, where that's kind of the thing you don't touch. And so we were really wary, and I remember a number of Treasury secretaries that we worked under were very wary of kind of going there. So it's fair to say that Congress pushed us out of our comfort zone on that. On oil, we were also pushed out of our comfort zone, and the president has a number of responsibilities. One of them is to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. One of them is to avoid tipping the world into a global recession if oil prices go up to $200. And so the Secretary of the Treasury, the president, were trying to balance a number of different things. And the assessments that we got when we put the question to the economists are, if you came close to getting the world to cold turkey on Iran, you would see $200, $250 a barrel oil. And that wasn't even if you could get to zero. That was if you got close to zero, which is frightening and would have been a disaster for the American economy, for the American people. So what commenced was a give and take, which is exactly what should happen. And we dealt with some very good people up on the Hill in terms of senators and their staffs. And we ultimately came to a compromise agreement, which required foreign countries that continued to import Iran's oil to, quote, significantly reduce the amount that they were importing every 6 months, and to show the U.S. that they had hit a new low every 6 months. If so, they could win an exemption or a waiver from sanctions. If they couldn't show us that, then their banks who were paying for the Iranian oil would be subject to these dramatic consequences that Stuart was talking about. And Congress settled on that as the mechanism. It was very powerful. So let me just end with 2 points, one to the pluses and one to the perils. The pluses were Iran's oil exports dropped by 60%, as you noted, which was beyond our dreams, actually. We didn't know that we would have that level of success with China and a lot of other countries who did not see eye to eye with us, to put it gently, bringing down their oil imports to the point where Iran ran out of storage room in their storage tanks. They actually had to load oil onto tankers and just have them doing laps in the Persian Gulf because there was no one to take a delivery. So that's a huge success. And a secondary effect of that was the payments to Iran were getting bottled up in these countries. So you mentioned $100 billion of Iran's assets frozen. They weren't frozen, if you're looking at it from a legal sense, because they weren't in a US bank account. They were sitting in South Korea, in Japan, in China, and those countries did not have sanctions that required them to be frozen. They were more restricted, and we were dictating the terms of that. Now, the amount by the time of the Iran deal was about $50 billion, but when people said after the Iran deal those accounts were unfrozen, that's not right. This was Iran's money sitting in South Korea, and one of the consequences of the Iran deal was South Korean banks got to release the funds without those same restrictions. So a lot of positives in terms of severe pressure on Iran and on their decision makers, which we saw in the room when we were negotiating. Final point on the perils or the risks. When we went up to have these discussions with Congress, we flagged that what they were threatening was extraordinary, namely going to China and saying your largest banks are going to be cut off from the dollar. And this is the largest holder of US treasuries, by the way, in the world. Your largest banks are going to be cut off from the dollar if you don't play by our rules. And those are called secondary sanctions because they're reaching into another country, tell them what to do. We flagged those risks for some very smart senators and representatives. And what we heard back was, got it. We understand that that's an extraordinary step, and we should take that only in the most extreme situations. But this Iran threat is, and then the term they used is a Latin term, sui generis, one of a kind. The world has never seen a threat like that. And you didn't need to convince me that the Iran threat was extreme. No one wanted to see a country that's the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism getting its hand on a nuclear weapon. But my worry at the time is what looks sui generis today is not going to be sui generis in a few months or in a few years. And that worry turned out to be right. So this tool of secondary sanctions, which the Senate was looking at as we're going to use this once, has since been used again and again and again against Venezuela, against Russia. And I understand it. In the moment, when you're in the National Security Council room and there's a severe threat to democratic rights in Venezuela, a severe threat to the people of Ukraine, a severe threat to the people in Xinjiang, these tools look like you'd be reckless not to use them. And so the way I talk about it when I teach these issues to my students is the ceiling has a way of very quickly becoming the floor in terms of economic statecraft. And a president is looked at as weak if they don't take the measure that was viewed as extreme 2 years ago. So that's just a bit of a warning.
It's a really good point, yes.
I just want to, and Adam, that was incredible. But just to sort of loop back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, just think about what Adam just described, right? We're talking about in the 1990s, for an oil embargo on Iraq, you needed, military surveillance of the Persian Gulf 24/7. What Adam's discussing and what happened in 2012, because it's really remarkable, is this is a unilateral American policy. It's passed by Congress. That's designed by people like Adam and others at OFAC who are negotiating this with Congress, that has dramatic impacts on Iran's oil sales, that cuts their oil sales by 60% without deploying any military forces, just by signing a document in a Treasury Department annex. I mean, and what you were saying, it's not just that the threshold for the use of sanctions has gone down, it's that the impact has gone significantly up over time. And so, I think what you've said, Adam, is so important because, and what I hope people find in the book is, these tools, we need to understand them because we are really playing with fire if we're going to be using them as frequently as we are now.
I'm conscious of time, and I do want to be able to turn it over to the audience for questions soon. So I think I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to China. Well, actually, you know what? Sorry, if I can take a step back. If we could go back to Russia for a minute, from Iran to Russia, because I know, we talked a little bit, Ambassador Fried, about the need to work with European partners on, especially with the 2014 annex of Crimea. But, fast forwarding to 2022, we saw where the US government kind of immediately started engaging with G7 coalition partners to increase this economic pressure on Russia and kind of move up the sanctions escalation ladder that I would argue that you kind of created back in 2014 in response to its invasion in 2022. So, did you have advice to the Biden administration at that point?
Well, I knew Dilip because Dilip had he'd gone with me to Europe a few times. His job was to keep an eye on me, to make sure I wouldn't trash the international financial system. When I left government at the beginning of the first Trump administration, I left a sanctions escalation list. And in 2022, what they did was on that list, except the biggest thing, which was the immobilization of the Russian foreign exchange reserves. I never thought of it, but if I had thought of it, I would have been utterly incapable of carrying it out, because Dilip Singh speaks Treasury dialect, okay? It's a thing. He speaks Treasury dialect. Even though, and the book describes this well, even though he had to overcome the resistance of Janet Yellen, he had the ability to do so because he speaks that language. I didn't. I could have never overcome her objections. So it was just brilliant. The way that done was Dilip's not here, so somebody's got to shout it out, because it was just wonderful. And it was a surprise. It was, Adams talked about that red line of not going after central banks, and he did it. And he did it with the G7, and he did it over a weekend, which he was building on the habits of cooperation. But he was also building on all of the experience, including the experience of the Iran oil, where you could do stuff that looked impossible. Now, I get Adam's worry about ceilings becoming floors. That's not nothing, but this was the right move. Putin should not be allowed to hide behind international norms when he's starting a war of aggression for no good reason. They're absolutely justified. And it hit them hard. And one more thing about sanctions, you haven't asked it, but it's around. Have they worked? And the argument is usually made no, because Russia's still fighting the war. Well, I'm so old, I remember Reagan, a Carter administration and Reagan administration economic pressure on the Soviet Union, which was universally considered to be a fiasco, a disaster, counterproductive, stupid, big fights with the Europeans, pointless mess. The 80s, a disaster for our policy, except, well, wait a minute. What happened at the end of the 1980s? The Soviet economy collapses, not because we killed it, but because our miserable second-rate economic pressure made it that much harder for the Soviet economy to avoid the consequences of its own, as Lenin used to say, internal contradictions.
Can I make a point, Dan? Because I think that you just illustrate something that I think is important about this whole area. And I agree with what Eddie says in the book about how we need to understand these tools and have the right analytics behind them and understand them better so that we can deploy them more effectively. But what you just described is exactly the argument that always happens in sanctions. So we'll be putting financial pressure on a target, and people will come in the room and say, it's not working because they still have a nuclear program or whatever the objective is. And half the room will say, yeah, this is stupid, we should stop doing it. And the other half will say, that's because we haven't done it enough yet. And they're both right. They're both right.
Sure.
And so the structure of the argument is always the same, even if the particulars are different. How many times did we face why are we bothering with sanctions on Iran? They're not working. And we were in there arguing, no, they're fantastic. Look at all these banks that have cut them off, all the pressure, the inflation, all the, how difficult it is for the Iranians. And other people saying, well, they're not working. And then my narrative in life now is that, well, they did work. Why? Because the purpose of them was to get Iran to come to the table and say, we'll negotiate a deal. The only dispute now is, that definitely happened. The dispute is whether, was the deal good enough, or should we have, as I said, kept going with more sanctions to get a better deal? And so my view is, those measures were very effective, but that's always a debate.
And the debate about the Russia sanctions is still going on. And sometime today, we may learn whether President Trump, after his call with Putin, is going to say, I'm being stiffed, so we're increasing sanctions on Russia, or whether he's going to say, we have a great deal, my friend Vladimir, and we're going to start reducing sanctions, or somewhere's in between. We don't know, but I am influenced by the experience of the 1980s. Sanctions and pressure don't work until they do, which means to get into the room that you were describing, Stuart, you have to mean it. I never had much use for some of the smaller sanctions regimes that were done to check a box. Somebody in some country is doing something you don't like, so you got to do something. If you're going to impose sanctions, you need to mean it. With Iran, with Russia.
I can agree with that. Yeah.
With respect to China, although export controls may be the more effective tactic. And the impact on the Russian economy is not as immediate as we would like and hoped, and as the Biden people sort of promised themselves. But if you stand back and look, it's profound. You can tell. You can see the deterioration, only we have to mean it. And I don't know where we're going to end up in this administration. That happily is another topic.
And it's a good segue, I think, to the next conversation I want to talk about with China too, because I think your point also reflects what Nazak was saying earlier, of just of hitting hard and fast, and not being able to provide the room to come up with different efforts to kind of get around some of these things. And I think that's a bit demonstrated, at least for me, in the context of China, especially where China is working around our sanctions to help Russia as well as Iran evade the U.S. pressure and sanctions. And it's a question kind of for all of us, but then I wanted to turn it over to Nazak because she had some specific examples and experience on the China front. But with China, I mean, the US, we've relied really more on our dominance in innovation and technology as our choke point when it comes to China, as opposed to the financial space, maybe outside of the bank situation with Macau and North Korea. But from my perspective, it really does appear that our economic approach towards China is where you see the increased importance of commerce. And the authorities that they have as kind of critical to our national security apparatus. And so from your perspectives, I mean, when did this shift occur? Is it when we've identified different choke points and then we can figure out, like, is it commerce, is it treasury? I mean, who's kind of the lead player in this? And then, when did that realization happen for the US government as it relates to China, that we may have more pressure points on the innovation and technology space as opposed to the financial levers?
I mean, I think that goes to the core point of choke point, right? What is a choke point, right? China, whether we sanction, do sectoral, whatever kind of sanctions on China, that's not what's driving the Chinese economy. Driving the Chinese economy is manufacturing, know-how, IP, et cetera. And so we're not going to stop that if we sanction a multitude of entities or sectors. So what's critical, again, about this concept of choke point is, what is the choke point that's going to work? What is the choke point that matters? And what is the choke point that is driving a country's economy and the high threat behavior that we perceive?
Yeah. Did you?
Well, I do have a point to make that I'd like to make about commerce, which is I agree with what Nazak just said. You have to understand what you're aiming at. And when I look at the Commerce Department, which is critical to our efforts going forward, and maybe more so than ever, and I think about the transition that we made in the Treasury Department in 2004, where they said, okay, we're going to create a national security, enterprise at Treasury, have Treasury become part of the intelligence community, create its own intelligence analytical function. And when I look at the Commerce Department, I think, well, why wouldn't we do that with the Commerce Department now, given how important it is? And, it's fun, actually, I sit here thinking, Adam and I get credit for the innovation of the Treasury Department. Actually, a lot of the credit should go to the intelligence analysts that were helping us identify what's the right target, what's the right choke point in a small sense to go for. And the Commerce Department doesn't have that capability yet. And I also remember at Treasury people saying, oh, we don't need it because someone else will give us the intel. So we don't need to be part of the intelligence community. And then anyone who lived through that time at Treasury, and I see some people in the room, where we went from just being a taker of intel that they decided, hey, maybe the Treasury Department should see this, and being part of the community and having our own analysts is dramatic. It changed the whole culture of the department. And I think that it's hard to predict how much more effective commerce could be until you did it, because I think they may come up with ideas that people haven't thought of, just like, frankly, oh, maybe we should use the financial system, and we're not sanctioned out on Iran, So there may be some breakthrough that comes from that remake.
Yeah.
And if I may, too, I think you mentioned earlier, Chokepoints, the book, focuses as much on the people as the policies. And the reason I decided to do that is my own experience. I do believe that the actual people sitting in the seats make a difference. And if you go back to the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, which I think deserves tremendous credit for really changing the approach of the US on China, right? Because similar to the way, Stuart, I think you and Adam back in 2006 proved that there were ways to pressure Iran that weren't just going to the UN Security Council. I think it was during the first Trump administration that this sort of belief that China was too big to sanction, or that we couldn't fight back against China's economic aggression, really was, that was proved wrong, right? And the reason I bring up people and bureaucratic politics, if you look at the Treasury Department during the first Trump administration, they were not at all in favor of a tough China policy. And I'm not saying anything that hasn't been reported elsewhere, but Stephen Mnuchin was much more in favor of sort of a traditionalist, integrationist approach with China. Wilbur Ross at the Commerce Department was much tougher on China. And so I think, we can all talk about strategy and, maybe the semiconductor supply chain is this great choke point versus finance, but it's also who controls it, right? And I think maybe had you had Wilbur Ross at Treasury and Stephen Mnuchin at Commerce, you would have had sanctions on Huawei or something.
I'm glad we didn't.
I think it's important. And look, Nazak, you also. You were at Commerce at this really important point, right? Where we did go ahead with the Huawei export controls.
I mean, that's just why I joined the administration. I've just been doing China. I was on the front line of the U.S.-China economic competition since China joined the WTO, and I felt really compelled. This is the first time somebody's going to take the bull by the horns and do something about China. And the relationship between, and you're right, people do matter. The relationship with Wilbur Ross was really, really good. We had trust. He was a businessman. He knew industry, economics, analysis. I'm an economist. I've been doing industry forever. So we spoke the same language, and there was a good bit of trust. And so with respect to Huawei in particular, I would make recommendations, and he would say, let's go for it. But sort of, I think, leading up to sort of Huawei being put on the entity list, I mean, Huawei had violated financial sanctions against Iran. And at the time, there was a movement independently to put Huawei on the entity list for all the ways that Huawei was aiding and abetting and providing capabilities to our adversaries, including Iran. And then we have this notion, this sort of finding that Huawei has violated financial sanctions against Iran. And traditionally, right, like your default position is to impose sanctions on that entity. Now, we don't sanction every single entity in China because, the whole debate about overusing the sanctions. But I really felt like it was full deterrence tool to sanction Huawei. And you could carve out, do carve-outs and stuff. But that we really needed to make a point to China that if you help Iran and if you help our adversaries, you don't know if we're going to target you. Keep them guessing, right? So symbolically cherry pick one here, one there, so you just create deterrence. Now, of course, with Mnuchin just did not like us touching Huawei at all. So we ended up in this sort of middle of the road option, which was to entity list Huawei. It was really, Huawei is a really great success story, and it is a tragedy at the same time. The great success story is that this was unilateral, right? There's all this like Washington wonks like to debate unilateral versus multilateral. We moved unilaterally, but we shared, we were great consumers of intelligence. And, I would actually say that there was lots really good intelligence on like Google too with reporting. And I see, there's some of it was useful, some of it was like I can get it on Google anyway. But there was this intelligence sharing that we did with our allies. And to say, look, this is a problem with Huawei, you've got to do something about it. And what we saw over the course of 18 years later, the world understood that Huawei, which is a symbol of China tech threat, people understood that Huawei was problematic, and they started removing Huawei, our trading partners, countries around the world, out of their infrastructure. The tragedy with Huawei is that as we tinkered around with tools for the wonks, the foreign direct product rules, as we tinkered around with those rules that prevent things produced abroad from going to Huawei, we actually weakened the license policy. So when you're on the entity list, you usually have the presumption of denial associated with the licensing policy. And over time, that was changed for the majority of the licenses to case by case. Under BIS's statistics, we have like a 99+ license approval rate, right? And so then the task force on China at the time is up in arms. Why is BIS approving all these licenses to Huawei? I thought they were on the entity list. Well, look at the license review policy, right? Why that happened, I think there was still a debate between, the hawks and the non-hawks. But you've got what Huawei, I think what everybody's takeaway should be is this sort of first move towards doing something more aggressively to China. It was the first move into the tech competition. How do we use our tools to counter China's tech competition? this great success story is that, yes, we can move unilaterally and get everybody to, generally under US's top cover, move quietly in that direction. And the tragedy was we've got to do better going forward.
That's great. At this point, I think I'm going to turn to the audience for any questions, just so we can take some. Yeah, and I think a microphone's coming for you.
Thank you. My name is Natalie Jaresko. I'm a non-resident distinguished scholar here at the Atlantic Council. I'm the former Minister of Finance of Ukraine. So I am grateful for all of the sanctions that have been deployed and export controls since 14 and then again in 22. And I agree that sanctions can be a very successful tool, foreign policy tool, and that they're very cost effective. But I would question two things that in my mind have massively affected the value of these tools in the case of Russia. And one is that I don't think we've been clear about our objectives. And I think both the stakeholders don't understand the objectives, and I think some of the actual allies don't understand the objectives. And I think if we're not clear about the objectives, there's no way we can achieve them. And so that's one element. And the second is that we haven't invested. I understand it's cost effective, but we haven't invested in the enforcement. You mentioned that the banks enforce, but that's just for the financial system. There's so much more enforcement, and we're seeing that. So when we dribble out the sanctions in this way, is it because our objectives are changing along the way? Or did we have, let's say in 22, a clear objective that we wanted to make it quickly too expensive and difficult for Putin to continue this war? Eddie and I have had this conversation probably since February 2022. If that wasn't our objective, then what was it? Again, I think we're not clear, and expectations then are very, very, very varied.
Let me add one thing, at least from my experience. The U.S. always fears economic impact, right? What are the unintended consequences of our actions? And when we have fear driving our policies, our adversaries are going to take advantage of that fear, and they know exactly where those gaps are. So on one hand, I would say we don't want to completely upend the economic system, but we can do way better than we're doing, and we have to move without fear if we're going to be effective.
Sir?
I think that critique is fair. I think there was a debate within the administration, and we slowly and inconsistently shifted. I wasn't part of the Biden administration, but you could see them shifting from we're sanctioning Russia to get a good deal to end the war and end the sanctions, which was the Obama position officially, to we're sanctioning Russia to weaken their economy so they can't do this anymore. They said it, but they also said it inconsistently. I think they were too slow to move on oil sanctions, and Eddie did a masterful job talking about the debate about the oil price cap, which was the compromise. But they only moved to, after the election, the very end of the administration, to really hit the oil sector the way they should have. I also think you have a point about enforcement, and I'll say it because you didn't, but it was implied, secondary sanctions. You need to mean it. And if we mean it, then we should be more liberal in our threats and use of secondary sanctions. And we should go after companies that are playing games, especially with respect to technology transfer. Banks have a culture of sanctions compliance, thanks to these guys. Corporations do not. I did due diligence. Yeah, no, you didn't. And we ought to have put some more heads on a pike and sooner. When I wanted to talk to a company and let them know that we were serious, I would invite somebody from OFAC enforcement to sit in. Because of the rules, they couldn't say anything. But that was even better. Just sit there. I'll introduce you. He's from OFAC enforcement.
Dan was in the government when I was in my job, but he wasn't in his sanctions role. He was the Assistant Secretary for Europe. I would have loved to have you from the State Department when I was in my job. What a difference you would have made.
Well, but you see where I'm headed with this, Natalie. we need to be, we need to get corporations to understand that we're coming after them if they mess around. We're not, there was one major European company that played it cute with us with respect to turbines. You know who I'm talking about. We should have made an example of them. Like, you lie to us.
That's kind of my question to all of you. I understand it's a cost-effective and it could be a very successful tool. But if we're not really applying it, if we're dribbling it out, then we cannot achieve the objective. If we're not enforcing, we can't achieve the objective. So if this is becoming one of the most critical and valuable foreign policy tools, then don't you have to use it efficiently?
I think Treasury's thinking about the objective of sanctions has also changed. Treasury is really looking at sanctions as just increasing costs, not how to cripple the economy so it collapses, right? And so they can stop doing the bad things. And if your objective is just to increase the cost, then you can rationalize, I'm just going to dribble them out.
I think that depends on the program. Right? Yeah. Certainly that wasn't what we were thinking about Iran.
No, not Iran, but I'm just saying now the approach in thinking about Russia, because this is relevant to the question, right? The shift in the thinking of how you guys went bigger and how we're going lighter. And the real thinking now is just to increase economic costs rather than doing something more dramatic. And we need to help them get back to a better way of thinking about the intent of sanctions when we have something this dramatic happen with Russia and Ukraine.
And Nazak, if I may, so Natalie, I think you bring up a really important point. It's something else I'm hoping to accomplish with this book. In 2004 was when Stewart moved over from the Justice Department to the Treasury Department as the first Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. That job is still the Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. I think there's something in that we still have the apparatus for economic warfare that comes out of the age of 9/11, right? When our focus really was on curbing the flows of finance to terrorist groups. It wasn't on stopping Putin from conquering Ukraine, which is just an order of magnitude of a higher geopolitical objective. So one thing I'm hoping, like I said, was to spread awareness and build knowledge of these tools. But what we really need here in this town, in Washington, we need reform. We need to fix how our government does these tools so that we can use them strategically. Because I think some of what you're talking about, Natalie, it's not because the Biden administration thought the right strategy was incremental sanctions escalation. It's a pathology of our bureaucratic process. If we had the type of sanctions planning that the Pentagon has for military planning, I think we would have been much more effective at potentially deterring Putin from invading Ukraine.
I just want to come in here briefly because I, too, am frustrated by aspects of the Russia sanctions, and we don't have a representative of the Biden administration who was the steward of that campaign to defend the Biden campaign. So I feel obligated to, at least as a bystander, say one or two things. The pace and aggressiveness of the sanctions as the tanks were descending on Kyiv has never been seen before in the world. So when you say dribbling it out, there's aspects of this that were follow-on and iterative, but seizing Russia's central bank assets in Japan, EU, UK, US, and then supplemental sanctions against Russia's banks, SWIFT sanctions, nothing has ever happened that quickly and that massively, and it was staggering to watch it from the outside. So I give them a lot of credit for that. One of the big punches that was held was energy. And I'm not an energy expert, but I don't know what you do when your allies, who are the most imperiled by Russia, the Eastern Europeans, are daily dependent on gas deliveries from Russia. Do you put secondary sanctions in place where you say, we're going to destroy your banks in Austria, Hungary, et cetera, if you take a single delivery of Russian gas? So that puts them to the choice of, do the citizens go into blackouts and freezing winter? It's really hard. I'm not saying that they made the right choice or the wrong choice. I'm trying to illustrate the challenges in that moment of going to 100%.
But I just want to say there's serious, significant components of Russia's military apparatus that were left out of sanctions year one, year two, right? And so I get your points and they're all valid, but let's also kind of this concept of choke points and scoping, let's really focus on what's been left out and think, does that make rational sense?
And so I was still at least at Treasury when the sanctions in 2022 came online, and my team supported a lot of the OFAC designations. But I think what's interesting is that these were very big, impactful actions with SWIFT and some of the other hard-hitting financial sanctions. What's interesting to me is that I think that we may be, I hate the word intelligence failure, because as a former intelligence officer, I don't see things as failures, but I think we kind of misjudged. Like we saw what happened with Crimea in 2014, and when we went hard on Russia, Putin pulled back. This time he didn't pull back, right? No, but he went, yes. So I say that with, a lot of caveats. But I think what's interesting is that what this kind of gets to for me, and Eddie raises it in the book, so maybe if this could be like a good point for us to kind of to wrap up too, is that you're calling for an economic war council. And I think, and I would agree with you. I mean, I'd like you to kind of go into more detail on what you mean by that, but just kind of as a practitioner in this field, I think one of the things that I was always missing was being able to really kind of think ahead and what is the long-term economic impact of these actions, so we could more accurately target or identify what is the true thing that we could do to truly hit our objective, versus kind of rolling things out and just hope oh, what's that going to do? And let's punch again and keep punching. So
Sure. Yeah. Look, I think this really ties into what I was just saying, where we need more strategy. We need more foresight when it comes to economic warfare. We need to take it more seriously than we do now. We can't just be scrambling to the Situation Room and coming up with policy options on the fly. I think timelines are important, right? Stewart has this epiphany that he can go directly to the banks and gets Condoleezza Rice to sign on to that Iran strategy in early 2006, right? Adam gets the JPOA with Iran in 2013. That's 7 years. There are two different administrations. You need that kind of consistency, that kind of strategy. It's rare to have the continuity in personnel. Barack Obama reappointed Stewart into his job, which is something that doesn't oftentimes happen between administrations. I think the way for us to do this, given the constraints of our political system, is to create a more intelligent, streamlined bureaucratic structure. In an ideal world, you would have an agency that actually was responsible for this. And there are certain governments that are moving in that direction. I mean, Japan now has a Minister of State for Economic Security. Probably in a more, a less ambitious form, you would have something like a standing interagency body that does this. And critically too, Kim, I think you need this at the multilateral level too. What Dan accomplished in 2014, in which I was privileged to have a front row seat to, was he built a coalition with the G7, with other countries like the Australians, like the Poles, like the Norwegians, that did multilateral sort of coalition of a willing sanctions against Russia. The Biden administration revived that coalition in 2021 and 2022. But we can't trust and just expect that these coalitions can be built for every single crisis. We should have standing bodies internationally to coordinate these measures, just like we have with military force through NATO. So I think really what I'm trying to do with this is a call to action that we need to take these measures seriously, both internally in the US government and with our allies internationally.
Can I make one point, which I agree with what you just said, Eddie? The strategy piece is important, and having people write a book like this actually is part of that. But also, first of all, hearing Dan talk today, when I am sitting back thinking it really is a dramatic change from what the State Department was the first 4 or 5 years that I was trying to do this. It was, constantly this is our thing, stay away, this kind of stuff. But we also have people, there's an intellectual analysis piece of this that's going on, not just in the book, but Adam teaches about this, and Juan teaches about, that we're developing sort of an intellectual framework around this a little smaller scale, which is right, but it's a small analogy to what military strategies like that it is worth thinking about these things in the same way and developing sort of a doctrine around it, and that there are people like Adam and you and others doing that.
Yeah, and it's and I know Dilip, he wanted to be here today, but he's definitely been, especially working with the Atlantic Council.
Really great things, and I Lieb also has written some really, really thoughtful pieces.
And one thing just finally to add is also just with respect to China, because I think most agree that that is sort of the biggest emerging threat. Look at the way in which the world has really started to come to realize the problems with China, right? And Europe taking unprecedented moves, and Brazil taking unprecedented moves. And so to further support the sort of war council idea, there's formalities we can bring to it, but a war council idea can also create structure so that countries can move informally, right, at their own pace and their own way by kind of getting that top cover. But I really want to emphasize the movement that has already started with respect to China, and how do we capitalize it to make it more effective before the balance of power sort of moves in the opposite direction.
That's great.
One cautionary note, though, at the end. I think you're right about China in general, and specifically right with respect to the first Trump administration. They created this new model and carried it out with a reasonable degree of success. The trouble is, now looking at the second Trump administration, they have trouble distinguishing friends with whom we have differences and foes. I mean, I'm going to put that bluntly, but I'll stand by that.
Yeah, no, and that's fair, but I will also signal a Jean-Paul Sartre sort of philosophy as don't judge until the story's ended.
Fair enough.
And so
fair enough.
I actually think I understand the strategy behind what's being done, but we'll save that for another discussion. But the story's not over yet.
I agree, and I hope you're right. Prove me wrong, I will be delighted. But to be fair, you are right. We don't know, on Russia, Ukraine, the Trump administration policy could succeed if we decide we mean it, as opposed to meaning something else.
And on that note, I would like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today. Please join me in thank everyone. This was a fantastic discussion. Before everyone gets off stage, I just want to make a note that Chokepoints is available for purchase anywhere that you prefer to buy your books. And then we also have them for sale by Politics and Prose in our lobby today, and Eddie is offered to sign copies. So please take advantage of that for those in the audience. And then also just keep a lookout for upcoming events at the Atlantic Council. We have some great programming coming up during IMF World Bank meetings next month. So thank you again for all your time today, and have a good rest of the day.